this is Dan Cortopassi of TSG Multimedia. Welcome to Model Railroading 101. As usual, I'm sitting in front of the camera, and John is sitting behind the camera making everything look good.
And wearing a disguise.
Yeah, and still not fooling anyone. Last time was part one of our diesels program, and we talked about diesels up to 1960 or so. We talked a little bit about the history of diesels, a little bit about how they work and how they're used. And in this episode, we're going to focus on diesels from around 1960 up through about the mid-1980s.
Oh, I like this one.
Yeah, these are some of my favorites, actually. And then in the next program, which will be number 3, we'll focus on more modern stuff. And as usual, this is an overview. So there isn't time to talk about every single diesel that was produced in those years. So we're pretty much hitting the highlights and the most common ones.
Sounds like a plan.
So before we get into specific models, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the manufacturers. Because by the 1960s, the number of companies producing diesels had dwindled. Some of the early diesel manufacturers like Baldwin and Fairbanks Morse either went out of business or stopped making locomotives. Also, Alco lasted until 1969, at least in the United States.
Oh, I remember Alco, yeah.
Yeah. The Electromotive Division of General Motors, or EMD, produced a lot of locomotives in the post-1960 time period, and General Electric also started to make their own locomotives to compete with EMD.
Yeah, aren't those the big ones now?
Yeah, GE is actually the market leader now, I think, but at this time they were kind of playing catch-up to EMD.
Yeah, so they were fierce competitors.
Right. EMD's 4-axle GP20 model was produced from late 1959 until 1962. It was turbocharged and produced 2,000 horsepower. It was kind of like an improved GP9.
Yeah, I was noticing this looks a lot like the low-hood GP9s that came out recently from, Athearn?
Yeah. GP20s were available either with a low hood or a high hood.
Uh-huh.
That was an option. So GP20, the way you tell it from a GP9 is it has different radiator fans, and there's also a little bulge behind the cab with louvers on it.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. Also, the air reservoirs are different on the sides. They're above the fuel tank.
Mm-hmm.
So the GP20 was more successful than its SD24 6-axle cousin. We talked about the SD24 in the last episode.
Yes.
Some railroads like Santa Fe and Southern Pacific rebuilt their GP20s, and they ran into the 1990s and even later. Some are still around even today on short lines.
Yeah.
EMD also made a normally aspirated GP18 during this time. I don't have a model of one of those, but it's very similar looking to a GP9. Like most GPs, these could be used either as switchers or road engines.
Yeah. I would imagine they probably used them as road engines when they were new, right?
At first, yeah. And then
mostly
over time, they would get downgraded into, local freights and branch lines and, switching duties. General Electric produced the U25B from 1959 until 1966. It was a 4-axle locomotive with 2,500 horsepower. And the U25B started GE on the road to becoming the major manufacturer it is today. Like the EMD GP series, the 4-axle U-boats, as they came to be known, could be used as switchers or road engines.
I've heard U-boat before. That's what they're talking about.
It's not, they called any GE with a U designation can be a U-boat. It's not just the U25B. They made a lot of them, but they're kind of generically known as U-boats. Anyway, one of the interesting features of the U25B that's still used today is a pressurized car body, and that basically helps to keep dust out of the inner workings of the engine.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah. So that was something that was adopted by EMD and, like I said, is still pretty much done today. It's interesting. Another interesting thing to note is that GE's model designations even today reflect the horsepower of the locomotive.
Also, 25 is 2,500.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas most of the time EMDs don't. They're just model numbers.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah. So in the case of the GP20, it did, but most of the time they don't. So anyway, the photo that I have is a model of an early production U28B, actually, which is kind of the successor to the U25B. But the U25B looks pretty much the same. Alco offered a 2,400 horsepower RS27 around the same time, but didn't sell very many.
Oh, too bad.
I don't have a model of one to show, unfortunately. In 1961, EMD introduced the GP30, which is a 2250 horsepower turbocharged locomotive that was designed to compete with the U25B. The GP30 is one of the easiest locomotives to identify because of the cab design. There's no other EMD engine that looks like this, with that sort of stepped cab design and the streamlined fairing that goes back through the dynamic brake section.
Yeah, it looks a lot wider on top.
Yeah. This is the only engine that was ever made like this. Another spotting feature of a GP30 is the 3 radiator fans with 2 large and 1 small in between. The GP30 is considered by some to be the first second-generation locomotive, meaning that it was designed to replace older diesels rather than steam engines.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. And like the GP20, a lot of GP30s were rebuilt and had long service lives. Some of the ex-Santa Fe GP30s even lasted into the BNSF era.
You still see these on locals or switchers or anything? Or?
I'm not sure if BNSF is still using any of these at this point, but there are some still around on, short lines and things.
Looks like one of Dan's models.
Yeah. I think this one actually has been on Dan's models. In 1963, EMD introduced the GP35, 2,500 horsepower turbocharged successor to the GP30. GP35s had the same fan arrangement, but introduced the basic cab design that EMD used up until the wide cab era.
Yeah, this one's not as wide on top. That weird streamline look, yeah.
Yeah, after this, EMD cabs pretty much look like that for just about everything they made, up until the 90s, basically. GP30s and GP35s are a really good size for a small layout because they're compact, but they can still pull pretty well. Can be used for switching or whatever.
Yeah.
A lot of GP35s, real ones, were also rebuilt and had long service lives. I don't have a picture of one, but EMD also made a DD35, which was basically 2 GP35s in the same frame with 2 4-axle trucks. And those produced 5,000 horsepower.
Oh, that must have been really powerful for the time, huh?
Yeah. So one of the general ways to tell an EMD from a GE, EMDs usually have fans on the roof, and the radiator grills are on the side in the back end.
Yeah.
GEs have the radiator grills on the roof, and the fans are inside the engine. You can't see them.
Okay.
So now some of the very new GEs have a couple little fans up there, like the Gevos and things, but we're not talking about those yet. So anyway, that's also the GEs tend to be more rounded, or at least the GEs of the period, whereas the EMDs are more boxy looking.
Okay.
Alco's C424 was introduced in 1963 as part of its Century series. This was a 2,400 horsepower locomotive that replaced the RS-27. They also made a 2,500 horsepower C425 that looks similar. For some comparison, EMD sold over 900 GP30s and over 1,200 GP35s. GE sold 476 U25Bs, and Alco sold 190 C424s and another 91 C425s. So definitely a smaller part of the market.
On their way out.
Yeah, the Century series was kind of Alco's last gasp. EMD introduced the GP40 in 1965, and this one is a 3,000 horsepower turbocharged road switcher. GP40s are a bit longer than GP35s and have 3 equal-sized radiator fans. And quite a few GP40s are still active, and many have been rebuilt. In fact, this particular one is a rebuilt GP40 that ran on the SP. Which, by the way, I'm not going to talk too much about rebuilt engines in this. I'm just focusing on the sort of the as-built models because they got all kinds of crazy names like, GP40-3 and all kinds of weird stuff. And I'm not going to get into that because there's just too much of it. Anyway, other 3,000 horsepower locomotives at the time were the Alco C430 and the GE U30B, neither of which I have models of.
Oh, okay. Use your imagination.
Yeah. In 1966, EMD produced the GP38, which is the same length as the GP40, but it only has 2 radiator fans in the back.
I can see that.
This one doesn't have dynamic brakes, but dynamic brakes aren't really a spotting feature. They were an option. So that's why it just has a plain hood in the middle.
That would have been the fan kind of closer to the cab there?
Kind of right in the center.
Yeah.
And all GP38s also have that little box behind the cab that kind of sticks up. That's an air filter box. GP38s are not turbocharged, and they only produce 2,000 horsepower. And a lot of these are still in service.
Yeah, it seems kind of weak considering everything else was 2,500 and above.
Yeah, they make good switch engines, though, and, for locals and things like that. GE's answer to the GP38 was the U23B, which was introduced in 1968.
Oh.
This is a 2250 horsepower locomotive, and this particular Western Pacific unit has EMD trucks. Sometimes railroads would trade in older diesels and the trucks would be reused. So it's sometimes possible to see EMD trucks on a GE unit or vice versa.
That's weird.
Yeah.
But I guess they were interchangeable. Maybe they were made that way for a reason, huh?
Yeah. I've heard people say that the EMD trucks rode better, but I'm not really sure about that. In 1969, EMD produced the DDA-40X for Union Pacific. These were dual prime mover locomotives, meaning they had 2 diesel engines in them. And they produced 6,600 horsepower, and they rode on a pair of 4-axle trucks. They were nicknamed Centennials on the UP because they were produced in 1969, which was the 100th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad.
Yeah.
And a number have been preserved. This one in the picture is actually up at the Portola, the Western Pacific Railroad Museum in Portola.
Oh, right. Yeah, I remember seeing that there. The thing's huge.
Yeah. And then there's actually one that still runs, 6936, and Union Pacific uses that for excursions.
I think I've seen pictures of that through the Feather River Canyon.
Yeah, and other places, yeah.
It seems like Union Pacific had a thing for big engines, didn't they?
Yeah, they did.
Because they had the big boys, which were those steam engines that we've looked at a couple times ago.
Right, and also the turbines.
Right. Oh, right. Those were huge, too.
Yeah.
Huh.
So, yeah, this was another big one. In 1972, EMD introduced its Dash-2 line. The GP40-2 was produced until 1986. Like the GP40, it was a 3,000 horsepower locomotive, and the Dash-2 line had improved modular internal electronics. Otherwise, it looked fairly similar. Some of the spotting features for a Dash-2 are the overhang at the rear of the cab. It's hard to see probably from that angle, but this cab actually, there's a little bit of an overhang in front of the door, whereas the pre-Dash-2 units, the roof just ended right at the back cab wall.
That's weird. Would they use that to fit some of the electronics in, or what?
I don't know if it was to keep water from dripping or something. There's also a water sight glass on the engineer's side, that little tiny round thing there.
Okay.
And the pre-Dash-2 units didn't have that. So those are a couple of the ways you can tell a Dash-2 from a pre-Dash-2 engine. And a lot of the GP40-2s are still in service.
Yeah, I think I've seen those.
Yeah.
But what about the 38-2?
We'll get to that next.
Okay.
So the GP38-2 was also introduced in 1972 to replace the GP38. And they were very popular, and many are still on the rails.
Yeah, don't they use... I think I've seen UP uses GP38-2s in their yards. They have the remote controls now, so they have the little beacons on the top.
Yeah, some of them do.
Lights, yeah.
And actually, some GP40s and 40-2s have been rebuilt to GP38-2 specs.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah. Otherwise, these are pretty similar to a regular GP38.
Oh, okay.
EMD also made something called the GP39-2 starting in 1974. And this was a 2,300 horsepower turbocharged locomotive. It had a smaller prime mover, but the turbocharger gave it more horsepower. And some railroads like Santa Fe preferred these over a GP38-2. And from what I've read, turbocharged locomotives perform better at high altitudes versus normally aspirated engines like a GP38-2. So the GP39-2 was a lot more successful than the GP39 that it replaced. There weren't actually very many GP39s built.
Oh. Yeah, even a GP39-2 seems sort of unusual to me.
Yeah,
like,
Santa Fe had a lot of them, though.
Yeah, I don't know how many I've even seen out there.
Yeah, this is a Portland and Western unit that's an ex-Santa Fe engine, basically.
Oh, right.
Yeah. In 1976, EMD produced the 1,500 horsepower GP15-1, basically the same horsepower as a GP9 or GP7. Well, GP7s had 1,500, GP9s were a little more, but anyway, this was kind of intended to give railroads an alternative to rebuilding older diesels.
Okay. Yeah, give them something new.
Right. GP15s are most often used in switching or local freight service, and a lot of these are still on the rails. In fact, UP uses a bunch of them. I've seen them switching like up in Vallejo and Benicia in that area and other places. Sometimes the GP15s are called baby tunnel motors because of the radiator arrangement in the back.
Oh, yeah, you can see that.
Yeah, EMD also made a couple of similar looking models, the GP15T and the GP15 AC, which was an AC traction engine. In 1977, GE introduced its Dash-7 line to replace the U series. Okay. The B23-7, which is what this is, had 2250 horsepower and was a competitor to the GP38-2 and the 39-2. GE also had B30-7s and B36-7s that looked similar but had more horsepower.
Yeah.
The easy way to tell a Dash-7 from a U-boat is to look at the long hood. Dash-7s have a bulge in the car body that U-boats don't, right here. See how it kind of bumps out?
Oh, yeah, toward the back, huh?
Yeah, so you can always tell a Dash-7 because they have that bump out in the back versus a U-boat doesn't. The EMD GP50 was introduced in 1980. It's a 3,500 horsepower turbocharged locomotive. GP50s look similar to late production GP40s.
Mm-hmm.
They have the slightly more bulgy Q fans. Those were designed for less noise. Some of the GP40s had those. But the easiest way to tell a GP50 from a GP40 is to look at the radiator grills, because the GP50's radiator grills are taller.
Oh, okay.
So that's the most obvious spotting feature. And initially, GP50s were intended for hotshot intermodal service.
What's a hot shot?
It's like the UPS trains or stack trains, or what they call Z trains.
Oh, like a high priority thing?
Right. Containers, trailers, those kind of things. I think back in the day there was a philosophy that high horsepower 4-axle locomotives would be really fast.
I saw a video, I think I borrowed it from you actually, that was about Santa Fe's intermodal.
Yeah.
And that's what they were using. But they were the silver and red war bonnets, most of them.
Yeah, those would be the GP60s, which we'll talk about next time.
Oh, all right.
I'm gonna stop with the 50s for this particular program. A lot of the GP50s are still around, but a lot of them have been demoted to local freight and switching duties. So at this point, they're basically just like any other Jeep hauling, boxcars around wherever,
Mixed freight trains on locals, right?
Right, right. So now we can talk a little about 6-axle locomotives.
Okay.
Generally, 6-axle locomotives are intended for heavy freight use.
So like a big coal train or something?
Yeah, or hauling stuff over mountains. A 6-axle locomotive has more tractive effort than a 4-axle locomotive of similar horsepower. So EMD never made an SD30, but in 1964 they introduced the SD35. And the SD35 had the same 2,500 turbocharged horsepower as the GP35, but it rode on 6-axle trucks. And GE's contemporary locomotive was the U25C, which also had 2,500 horsepower. I don't have a model of one of those to show you, but anyway.
And that was also 6 axles?
Yeah. Yeah. Looked like a U25B, but longer.
It's funny. We're getting into that whole thing like we talked about last time. I kept making a joke. Well, who was copying? Because somebody was copying. And I wonder if they were, someone, GE and
well, I think they pushed each other. One would come out with a bigger horsepower engine, so then the other one would have to do it.
Right, or else UP wouldn't buy it.
Right. Yeah. Right. Alco produced the 3,000 horsepower C630 from 1965 to 1968. This one is a C630M. And though Alco went out of business in 1969, their subsidiary Montreal Locomotive Works continued in business in Canada until 1985.
Oh, so they lasted a little longer up there.
Yeah. EMD's SD45 was first produced in 1965 and made 3,600 horsepower from a 20-cylinder turbocharged prime mover.
That's a huge engine.
It is. They made over 1,200 of them. Some of them suffered from reliability problems like broken crankshafts. In later years, a lot of them were rebuilt with 3,000 horsepower prime movers, basically making them the equivalent of an SD40 or 40-2.
Uh-huh.
The main spotting feature of an SD45 are the flared radiators.
You see those on more modern locomotives
yeah,
too now.
they kind of went back to that with some of the SD70s and the SD70 Aces and things, but...
we'll find out about those next time, right?
Right, we won't talk about those yet.
You just talked about it.
Well, okay.
I guess something to class clown.
Yeah. EMD also made an SDP45. These had room for steam generators and were intended for passenger service, though Erie-Lackawanna purchased some without the feature.
Why would they do that?
I think they were ballasted to be heavier. And actually this particular SP unit is actually an ex-Erie unit that was rebuilt. It's the only SDP45 model I have, so I'm using it.
Well, you got to use what you have.
Right. In 1966, GE introduced the 3,000 horsepower U30C. This model was followed up in 1968 by the 3,300 horsepower U33C and in 1971 by the 3,600 horsepower U36C. GE also offered 6-axle passenger units, including the U28CG and Cowl-bodied U30CG. I don't have models of either of those, but those were exclusive to the Santa Fe. Santa Fe wanted some new engines for the Super Chief and other things.
Oh, yeah.
In 1966, EMD brought out several new 6-axle diesels that used the same frame as an SD45.
Okay.
The SD40 was a 3,000 horsepower turbocharged locomotive, and because the car body is shorter than an SD45, SD40s have porches on the front and rear. So they have these like parts of the walkway that extend more than you normally see.
Yeah, it really is extended too.
Yeah. EMD also made something called an SD38, which was the same size overall as an SD40, but it was a 2,000 horsepower non-turbocharged locomotive.
So just not as strong as the...
Right. And one of the ways you tell the difference is these only had 2 radiator fans in the back versus 3 for an SD40.
Yeah, they look smaller or boxier or something. Is that...
Yeah, the dynamic brake fans are also smaller, at least on this engine.
Huh.
EMD also had an SD39, which was turbocharged with a smaller prime mover and made 2,300 horsepower.
It looks like those fans are bigger.
Yeah, the dynamic brake fans are bigger on this unit. One of the ways you tell a 39 from a 38 is because the 39s are turbocharged, they have this big exhaust hatch here, whereas the 38s have these small exhaust stacks.
Oh, I see. So is it only one on the 39? Is that right?
Yeah, because there's the turbocharger here, and that's the turbo exhaust, whereas these are just
regular exhaust.
Regular exhaust, yeah. And they also had EMD also offered an SDP40, which had a steam generator for passenger service. I don't have a model of one of those, but some railroads wanted those for replacing older passenger power. In 1967, Santa Fe ordered FP45s from EMD to power the Super Chief and some other passenger trains. The FP45 is a Cowl unit, meaning that it has a full-width body that is not structural. If you recall from our last program, locomotives like the F7 were cab units, meaning that the body is part of the structure.
Oh, is that what that is?
Yeah, so this is basically cosmetic. Essentially, this is an SD45 in a fancy body.
Oh, so they added stuff to the side to make it, to fill it out, kind of?
Right.
Yeah.
And the FP45s had steam generators for passenger service, and they were also used by the Milwaukee Road. After Amtrak took over in 1971, the FP45s were put into freight service.
Didn't Amtrak have some that looked like this?
They did. We'll get to those in a while, but they weren't FP45s. The F45 was another 3,000 horsepower Cowl unit. Main difference between this and an FP45 was that it didn't have steam generators. These were intended for freight service from the beginning.
Oh, okay.
They're a little bit shorter than the FP45s.
Is that because they don't have the steam generator? Or?
Right.
Oh.
Right. These are basically the same length as a normal SD45. And Santa Fe, Great Northern, and later Burlington Northern all had F45s. And then after, some of them were sold off to other railroads. In 1972, EMD's Dash-2 line included the new SD40-2. This had the same 3,000 horsepower as an SD40, but had the Dash-2 improvements like better electronics and things. They also rode on different trucks, and the porches on the SD40-2 are a little longer, although this one has a snoot nose, so that takes up some of that room.
This is the most famous SD40-2 on YouTube.
Yes, this is 5126, as if people hadn't seen enough of this thing yet.
Yeah.
I thought I'd bring it back yet again.
I recognized it.
Yeah.
It has that look to it, you know.
The SD40-2s were extremely successful, with nearly 4,000 produced by the time it was discontinued in 1989. And many are still in service. This is probably one of the most iconic locomotives of the era, actually. There were just a lot of these running around at one point. These days, a lot of them have been demoted from mainline freight service to local service and switching duties.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say a lot. I'd say probably most of them, if not all of them, have been. By now,
because they're more powerful engines, now.
Yeah,
yeah. These were kind of the standard road engine of the day.
Yeah, it's getting to the point now where I've seen even things as recent as SD70s on locals, and you're just like, wow, really? Already?
Yeah, I know. This is an SD45-2, which was kind of the replacement for the SD45. And it has a longer car body, but rides in the same frame as an SD40-2.
Yeah.
And one of the spotting features of these, it doesn't have the flared radiators like an SD45, but it has these 3 widely spaced radiator fans in the back.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is like the 25th Santa Fe locomotive we've looked at today, Dan. I thought you were an SP guy.
I am, but I like Santa Fe too.
Oh, Seems like you have more Santa Fe than you have Southern Pacific.
I might have brought more Santa Fe today just because that happened to be the way it worked out for example models.
I'm just laughing.
Yeah. There were also SD38-2 locomotives that were often used for switching and hump yard service. These look kind of like an SD40-2, but with only 2 radiator fans.
Oh, I see. Oh, speaking of SP a minute ago.
Right.
See, not only do I know this locomotive because I've seen it a lot, but I know what this one is.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell everybody else what it is?
Okay, well, in 1974, EMD introduced what are popularly called tunnel motors.
Uh-huh.
And these are basically SD40-2s or SD45-2s with a modified cooling system. These have radiators in the back that are arranged more like a GE locomotive, and they were designed for better cooling in long tunnels.
Because of
the snow sheds over Donner Pass,
right.
And also things like Moffett Tunnel.
Yeah.
These were originally purchased by the Southern Pacific, SP's Cotton Belt subsidiary, and Denver and Rio Grande Western. In later years, some of these found their way to other railroads. But
we went in search of these out in Trona.
Right. And the distinctive feature is the radiator section, because there aren't any other engines that really look like this. So the engine in the front is an SD40T-2.
Right, that we were just looking at.
Right. And that one has the long SD40-2 style porch on the front.
Oh.
In front of the nose.
I see where you're going with this, yeah.
And the one in the back is an SD45T-2, and in that one the cab is shoved a lot further toward the handrails.
Uh-huh. It's much further forward, yeah.
Yeah, that's because the SD45T-2s had a bigger prime mover.
Oh, so they have to make room for it inside by pushing everything to the end.
Right, a 20-cylinder versus a 16-cylinder. Okay, so in the back, the SD40T-2 has 2 access doors under the radiators.
The other one has 3, huh?
The other one has 3. Yeah, the SD45T-2 has 3. So those are kind of the big spotting features, other than the fact that the SD45T-2 has a longer body. So it's, shoved up against the handrails a lot more than the other one.
Yeah, like what we were just looking at in the front.
Right.
Yeah. So, Dan, this is another Santa Fe.
Yeah, it is.
And it's another yellow and blue bonnet.
Yeah, it is.
Wait.
Again, this is just what I happen to have as an example.
Dan, the Santa Fe guy.
Yeah. Anyway, this is a C30-7. And GE replaced its 6-axle U30C with the C30-7 in 1976. And just like the other -7 engines, it has the little bumped-out car body in front of the radiator.
Uh-huh.
The SD50 was introduced in 1981. It's a 3,500 horsepower turbocharged freight locomotive.
And it's patched for UP.
It is. This is an ex-Rio Grande unit. The SD50 included a number of design changes from previous models. Notably, the relocation of the dynamic brake fan to a position just behind the cab. That's this thing.
Oh,
so
yeah. That big round fan.
Yeah, older EMDs would have them in the middle here, and this one has it up here. So the roof line's a little cleaner looking. Amtrak came along in 1971 to take over most passenger service in the United States. And initially they made do with older passenger power that they inherited from the railroads. But in 1973, they went to EMD for a new locomotive. And that resulted in the SDP40F. And this was basically an SD40-2 and a Cowl unit body with a steam generator. And unfortunately, there were a series of derailments that led Amtrak to retire these engines prematurely. Some of them went to the Santa Fe, and they were rebuilt as SDF40-2 freight locomotives. That's the one in the back.
Uh-huh. Another Santa Fe locomotive, Dan.
Yeah, I know. They look similar to an FP45, but the radiators and fans are in different places.
I see.
Yeah. And GE also produced a 3,000 horsepower 6-axle Cowl unit for Amtrak, the P30CH. I don't have a model of one of those, but those were the first Amtrak engines that were equipped with HEP power from the factory. And those lasted longer. They were retired in the early 90s. Amtrak replaced the SDP40F with the 4-axle F40PH. Some F40PHs were built from trade-in parts and were designated F40PHR. Basically the same thing, though.
Was R for rebuild? Or
rebuild,
something?
Yeah. The F40PH was a 3,000 horsepower Cowl unit that was the mainstay of Amtrak's fleet until the early 1990s when the Genesis units were introduced.
Oh, we'll probably talk about those next time, huh?
Right. Amtrak retired its F40s in the 1990s, though some of them have survived as non-powered control units, or NPCUs. Canada's VIA also used F40s, as well as many commute agencies, sometimes in different variants.
Yeah, and they still do.
Yeah, Caltrain, Ace, Coaster, bunch of them use F40s.
Yeah, I think Metra has some of those still.
Metra's
too.
got a bunch of them. Yeah, there's variations. They don't all look exactly like the Amtrak engines, but they're
pretty similar. Yeah,
very similar, and a lot of those are still in service. So we've talked about freight engines and passenger engines. So now we can talk about some switchers.
Yeah, I think we did that last time too, didn't we?
Pretty much, yeah. So in 1966, EMD introduced the SW1500, which replaced some of the early models like the SW1200. It had 1,500 horsepower. There was also a 1,000 horsepower SW1000. This is one case where the name does actually match the horsepower.
Yeah, isn't that weird? Like, why are things so inconsistent?
I don't know why EMD was like that. Just about every other company, their designation had something to do with the horsepower. A lot of the SW1500s were delivered with flex coil trucks and MU capabilities, so they could actually function as road engines for local and branch line service.
Yeah, and I have seen similar locomotives to this in consists, like power lash-ups, entering the yard in Stockton. I can think of one right off the top of my head. I think I mentioned it last time.
Yeah.
I don't remember if we talked about it on camera, but I did mention it last time.
Yeah. In 1974, the MP15 DC replaced the SW1500. It's very similar, had the same horsepower, but it rides on Blomberg trucks.
And what does that mean?
They're the same kind of trucks you'd see on a Jeep. So they were even more road engine capable. MP stood for multi-purpose, which reflected the idea that it could be used as a road switcher or to move cars around in a yard.
Yeah, it definitely looks like one of those yard switchers.
Yeah.
What I'd expect to see in a yard.
Yeah.
Yeah, you notice we're seeing more Southern Pacific now, Dan.
Yeah. How about that?
I guess you do like Southern Pacific after all.
Yep. So this is an MP15 AC. These were introduced in 1975 by EMD, and it's basically an AC traction version of the MP15 DC. The main spotting difference is the tunnel motor-like radiators.
Yeah, I noticed that when you pull it off camera. I was saying, hey, it's a tunnel switcher.
Yeah, I think they're also slightly longer.
So that was good. Just like last time, there was some stuff that I knew already, and there was some stuff that I didn't know, right?
Right.
And there was some stuff that I knew before, but I had forgotten, and now I know it again. So now I'm probably going to forget it again, unfortunately.
All right. Well, anyway, I hope somebody else gets something out of it too, because these, like I said in the beginning, these are some of my favorite diesels.
Yeah. I think people are getting something out of it though, because people seem to really like this series, which is really great.
So. It's kind of fun to make, and so it's pretty cool, I think. Anyway, so next time we'll be covering more modern diesels, kind of from the mid '80s onward, and a lot of those are the ones that you see nowadays.
Yeah, that's great, because I'm really hoping to learn something that will help me be able to tell them apart, because they kind of all look the same to me.
Yeah, some of them kind of do. But anyway, we'll try to sort all that out and hopefully clear it up a bit.
Cool. I guess we'll see everybody next time.
Yeah.